everyone, and welcome to Disc Squared. Hi everyone, welcome to Disc Squared with me, your host, Hannah Gutierrez. Welcome back to those of you who have watched my first episode and are now here. Welcome in to anyone who's joining us for the first time. For those of you who watched my last episode, I mentioned that I would be featuring my mom in this one, and as it so happens, my last episode as well. So, Mom, care to introduce yourself?
My name is Sandra Gutierrez, and I am a Spanish teacher. I teach high school.
No, that's good. So, the overall discussion is about how academic discourse affects second language students. You know that?
Yes.
Yes, I told you. But this episode specifically focuses on what we call the missing perspective, which is basically what's missing in the sources for our research essay that we did. So my missing perspective that I found was parents, which is why I asked you to do this since you're my parent.
Correct.
Yes. And I wanted you to guest on this because we have very different academic experiences in terms of, not in like experience sense, but in where we went to school and what we spoke.
Right.
Like for example, your first language is Spanish. Mine is English. You grew up here in the RGV, but I grew up in Colorado. You attended public school. I attended private school. But in terms of higher education, I'm going to the school you went to.
Yes.
Yes. How I started this was to discuss what is the missing perspective, but I already touched on that, which is the perspective that's missing from the sources I used in my research essay. And if you haven't watched that video, feel free to go check it out. So, like I mentioned, the missing perspective I found and I'm using, the one that I'm using is parents. We know this topic involves students and educators, but where are the parents? So parents are arguably the most important person in this topic area. Would you agree or disagree?
I would agree.
Okay. Why? Initial thoughts.
I would agree that they're the missing component.
Yes, but would you also agree that they're the most important? Their opinion and their voice in this conversation is most important.
With regard to how they acquire the second language, or with regards to?
In regards to like academic discourse in general, or if you should raise your children bilingually? Because parents are the ones who make that decision, right?
Yes.
The kids won't choose to be
bilingual.
Right.
In my experience, I think my generation, and perhaps even the generation before, I think really like the idea of having bilingual children, teaching their kids their native language and then English, knowing that either you can speak it at home and learn English and Spanish at home, or knowing they'll acquire the native language at home and the English at school. However, it is a very hard thing to do. You have to be very dedicated to accomplish it.
So I've heard. I wouldn't know because I've never tried. And
right.
You never tried to teach me, which I completely understand in hindsight.
Yes.
But we'll talk about that later. So I want to establish the two main environments in the discussion, which is the home and the academic setting. So in the home, you have the home discourse, which is any form of communication that happens within the home. And then you have the academic discourse, which is any form of communication that occurs in the academic setting or at school. And that's any form of communication. So speaking, writing, anything. If you're homeschooled, this gets complicated. So we don't talk. I did not address homeschoolers. Sorry, homeschoolers listening.
Yes, you have been overlooked.
Sorry, you made it complicated. So of course, personality type is going to come into play with this. So some students like myself were much more comfortable speaking at home and would almost never speak up at school. Although I want to ask you, how often did I speak up at home? Do you remember?
As a child?
Yes, as a kid.
As before kindergarten?
Either one, before kindergarten or maybe up to like the third
Your
grade.
temperament is calm, quiet by nature, but I wouldn't say you were extremely quiet. If I asked you questions and asked you to elaborate, you would. You're just not an oversharer.
We also have people who are very comfortable in either setting and they can just talk all day.
Yes. Yes, very extroverted,
Yes.
comfortable in any setting around adults, children. Yes.
So in my last episode where I talked about my 3 sources, I had examples of non-native English speakers and native English speakers, and in both cases there was shown hesitation before speaking in the academic setting. Now, whether that's because English is not their first language or is their first language, there was both studies. Whether that's because they don't know English as their first language or it's just personality type, I don't know.
Okay. I think the non-native speaker hesitates because of many factors. For instance, in my particular case with Spanish and English, Spanish is very wordy compared to English. English tends to be more concise, perhaps, and you can sound different from the native English speaker because the native Spanish speaker who's learning English tends to translate in their mind, and so they tend to sound wordier, or they're afraid to make mistakes. For instance, adjective, noun mistakes, gender mistakes, mistakes in plurality. I think those things do affect whether the student is more willing to speak up.
Right, I think so too. You brought up Spanish. I like to bring up Korean since that's what I've been studying for a few years now, actually. And in Korean, one word can be an entire sentence, and you can establish not necessarily subject because you can omit the subject from the sentence and it's completely fine. But you can have tense and you can have formality. So then when you bring that to English, you hesitate because English always has to have a subject and English always has to have a verb. It's understandable why they would hesitate because you have to think of all the things that your native language does or doesn't have.
Correct.
And that you now have to think about. Or even with Spanish, how things have gender and English doesn't have gender. So that's another factor.
Yes, it's something else to think about, to take into consideration when you're thinking about speaking up. And maybe that affects the student that comes to, say, the U.S. and begins to learn English as their second language when they're older, maybe middle school and high school particularly, because at that point they've had more years of Spanish, whereas in my case, I was born in the United States. So although Spanish was my first language because it's the only language my parents speak, I began to learn English in kindergarten and on. So I don't think I had that particular problem because I started learning English when all kids start learning English.
So should parents make the conscious decision to raise their children bilingually if it means risking the child's academic discourse ability? And ability doesn't mean all or nothing. It just means more of a scale on where they would be. So if they were raised with English as their first language and only English, they would be more prepared, so to speak, to engage in that academic discourse properly.
Yes, I agree.
To meet those academic standards that educators have.
Yes.
Whereas if they were raised bilingually, they wouldn't necessarily be able to meet those standards because they've had 2 language inputs and outputs.
Correct.
If that makes sense.
It does. So you're asking me if, as a parent, I would still do it, knowing that there might be some ramifications?
The conscious decision, I want to raise my child bilingually.
I would, but I don't think I would do solely my native language at home, as in when you're at home, no English, we're only going to speak Spanish, and you won't speak English until you're in the school environment. I would not do that. I do think that can affect the child negatively. And I say that because they are hearing 2 different languages, 2 different phonologies, 2 different
semantics and syntax.
But mostly the sound of words are different. And again, sentence structure. Now, I would like for them to hear the second language at home, but not exclusively the parent native language. And I say that because if your child learns the sound, becomes familiar with inflection, how the words sound, how the letters sound, they're more likely to learn it better or have an easier time learning it and speaking it, even if they learn it later, as in high school or middle school. And hopefully avoid that disadvantage they might have if I split their home speech only to Spanish and their academic only to English.
That's similar, not exactly how Olivia and I were raised. But when we would come,
Yes.
when we would come down to Texas, we would hear it.
Mhm.
We would hear it often, and even though we
Yes.
didn't speak it, we still managed to pick some of it up.
Right.
So then,
and your ear is trained to hear how it's supposed to sound. So when you did take Spanish as a high schooler, you already had an understanding, say, of what the letters are supposed to sound like, as opposed to someone who's never heard it.
Right.
And they only speak English, so they are only familiar with English letter sounds.
Right. That's good, because that's what I was going to ask you. An honest opinion, when you taught me Spanish in high school, how did I do? Completely honest. Not because I'm your child, don't say anything.
No, I think you did well. I think you had a good sense of what words are supposed to sound like, what the letters are supposed to sound like. You can tell the difference between the way you sounded out words as opposed to someone who had never spoken it before or heard it. And it is, I wouldn't say it's extremely easy, but you can tell when you have a student who has been exposed to some of the language and how they pick it up when they're being taught it in high school, as opposed to the student who has never been exposed and is learning and is hearing it for the first time. There is a difference in their pronunciation, in my experience.
Sometimes I also wonder if learning Korean simultaneously helped me grasp concepts better. Because I remember
Yes.
I remember one lesson specifically when we were talking about there's 3 words to describe this, that, and that over there.
Uh-huh.
And we don't have the that over there word in English. We just
That's
have
right.
this and that.
That.
And in Korean, they have this, which is close to both the speaker and the listener. That, which is not close to the speaker.
Correct.
And then that over there, which is close to neither the speaker or the listener. Or is closer,
Correct.
or is, yeah. Okay. I just remember,
Yes.
I remember that lesson specifically.
Uh-huh.
Because I had learned that lesson in Korean not long before. And then also just learning terms like present progressive and all that.
Right.
So then when I would when I hear it in Spanish class, I think, oh, this is what it is in Korean, this is what it is in English.
I had that experience growing up, and particularly high school. I took Spanish, and really into college when I was taking specific grammar classes where I was learning structure and formation and those kinds of things, the syntax, that English became more clear to me. English grammar became more clear to me when I started learning Spanish grammar. And maybe because I wasn't great at English grammar, but learning the Spanish actually helped my English grammar.
So we would both agree that efficiently and effectively raising children bilingually requires a lot of maintenance in 2 languages. Duh.
Yes.
Bilingual, 2 languages. Duh.
Yes.
And prior to school, the maintenance seems easier because you just balance out both languages, input and output within the home. I mean, you could do we only speak native language at home, and then once you reach school, you learn the second language. So once the child enters the education system, you have this kind of broken balance if you go with the former, teaching both at the same time in the home. Does that make sense?
Repeat that?
Not the latter case, but the former case, when you teach both languages in the home prior to the education. You then, when they enter the education system, the balance will be thrown off because you will have one language overpowering the other, in a sense.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so then the parents have 2 basic choices, which is to either, 1, allow one language to overpower the other in terms of usage. So you continue to use both languages in the home while one is also being used at school. Or 2, you speak one language at home and the other at school. The problem I see with the latter, which is the speak one language at home and speak one at school, is that children will try to bring their home discourse, which is that one language, into their academic discourse, which is the other language, in which case they'll be corrected by the educators. The children bring one language to another language. So they're corrected by the teachers because they're bringing what they hear at home to what they do at school, what they say at school. Yeah.
Right. And again, they'll be corrected in pronunciation. They could be corrected in grammar issues.
Yeah, they could be corrected in words in general if they use that language in school.
Correct.
But I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that more later. I just wanted to say that. So obviously, I'm not trying to tell parents how to raise their kids, because each parent will do as they see fit, as they should. It's your choice and it's your children.
Sure.
But parents should consider how it'll affect their children in the long run. Yes, they might end up bilingual, but what about the foundation of the other core subjects that they're going to be learning in school? How will the parents ensure that the kids fully grasp onto those key concepts if they're being taught in their non-native language or in a language that they're not getting sufficient practice in at home? I mean, in the end, it's what holds more importance to the parents, bilingualism or a good educational foundation, which makes it sound like I'm biased toward the education, but I'm actually quite jealous of bilingual people. This isn't to say that bilingual kids are incapable of learning core subject concepts, because in reality it just depends on the student. But I think the majority will find it harder to grasp onto those concepts if it's not in their native language.
Well, that is one of the areas where the student that speaks the native language at home and then say English in the academic setting suffers from. They suffer with comprehension. So although they read, they're literate, they don't have a problem learning to read, but the comprehension component can be lacking. And I'm not saying that it's not there. It's just lacking, as opposed to the student that is learning both languages at home and then as well is learning the English at school. So they're not just getting it at school, they're also getting it at home. So the student the child that is learning one language at home, one language at school, seems to have not as good a comprehension. And comprehension is key, because in America and in the school system, we take standardized tests. Those things are given only in English, whether it's for the state or whether it's later on for college, the ACT, the SAT. Comprehension is vital. So if there is, in my case, I don't want my children to miss out on having a really good grasp of what comprehension. I don't want their comprehension to be lacking.
Yes, especially with the most basic of concepts in any subject, because all you do is build on that.
Right. So yes, that is key. For me, my preference is to speak both languages in the home so that my children have an ear for the sound of my native language and have them learn incrementally, and then perhaps in high school learn it in depth. But have them learning English continually.
Right.
In the home and then later in school.
So I think in conclusion, the raising children bilingually is just a really hard concept as it is. And maintaining the balance of both languages would take a lot of time and effort that some parents just don't have time for, because we haven't even factored in jobs and all that, and time that's just taken away. But let's say parents did have the time, though. There are still many other factors to consider that we didn't cover right now, which is exactly what I will talk about next episode. So join me in my last episode where I discuss some of my observation research and other factors of possibilities that can occur when raising children bilingually. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mom, for discussing this with me.
You're welcome.
It was fun. Goodbye.